The RAF Montrose in Angus, Scotland, was the oldest British military base before it closed in the 1950s. 35 miles northeast of Dundee, Montrose was the site for both training operations for young pilots and all-out aerial combat in both the First and Second World Wars between British and German planes. Many men have lost their lives over the skies of Montrose, in the surrounding fields and off Scotland's east coast. At least one of these lost souls are said to have remained at Montrose for decades, and at one point sightings of a long-dead pilot were so common and struck so much fear into some of the pilots stationed there that the British government was forced to officially recognise the problem. During the winter of 1940, Montrose was a cold and oppressive place, and on one particular night a low fog hung in the air while the pilots posted there tried to get some rest. They were now battle-worn after a lengthy combat with German fighter planes and bombers. At this late stage of 1940, the men at the Montrose base had already seen many of their fellow pilots die in these battles, and many of those still alive were either badly injured or not of sound mind. Of those well enough to fight another day, the quiet nights, although cold, were an opportunity to regain their strength. There was no sign of the German Luftwaffe on this particular night, so the men took advantage and laid down to sleep. That was until the familiar sounds of a German Heinkel bomber rose up from the distance and then thundered over the base and disappeared into the night. Expecting an imminent attack, the pilots jumped from their beds, slipped into their flying gear and prepared for takeoff. One experienced flight sergeant took to the skies first to try to hunt down the now unseen German bomber and shoot it down. The Hurricane fighter plane selected for the job disappeared into the night sky, its burning engines only just visible from the ground. The pilot in charge of the Hurricane fighter was the most experienced man on the airfield, with a reputation for being fearless in the face of the enemy. He searched the skies for the telltale burning engines of the German plane. He found nothing, and after 30 minutes the men on the ground decided that the enemy plane had left the area and called the search off, bringing the plane back into land. A radio message went out to the pilot to abort the mission. The pilot responded and began to descend back to the airfield. The Luftwaffe were known to lull British pilots into a false sense of security, only to attack once expectations had died down and landing lights were turned on. Knowing this, ground control turned on what they called glim lights, which were low-powered and vague in the darkness, only noticeable to the most experienced pilots who knew what they were looking for. So with the glim lights now turned on, the company awaited the return of their man. The Hurricane fighter plane came slowly into land and settled on the grass between the glim lights. No sooner had it touched down, the pilot rammed the throttle forward, firing the engines once again, and took off for a second time. Bewildered as to why this had happened, the men on the ground watched as the plane again roared into the sky. They assumed that the pilot had caught a glimpse of the German plane and continued his chase, as there was clearly no obstruction on the runway. The pilot then turned on the plane's bright navigation lights. For the men watching on the ground, this was suicide. If there was an enemy plane in the vicinity, the Hurricane would now be a sitting duck. Once again, the British plane came around to land. All on the ground awaited its arrival and to hear the sergeant's explanation. As he brought the plane in, the throttle was again suddenly thrust to full power, this time taking the fighter plane out over the sea. With no sign of the German bomber or an obstacle on the runway, the men on the ground decided to give the sergeant a clearer view of the base and turned on the powerful searchlight. They did this with some trepidation, as the light would surely give away the location of Montrose to any German planes lying in wait. Nevertheless, that's what they did, and soon the pilot saw his way to a smooth landing. The fighter plane taxied back to the base and the engine was shut down. The pilots on the ground all gathered around the plane awaiting the sergeant's explanation for his unusual actions. As the canopy of the plane slid back, the men saw the contorted, reddened face of the sergeant. He stepped down from his plane, shouting at the company, asking which fool had cut him off, and that it could have cost lives. An officer stepped forward and asked what he meant. The sergeant explained that there had been a plane sat across the runway in front of him, making it impossible for him to land. When the bewildered officer explained that there was no one else on the runway, the sergeant retorted, shouting, "What's wrong with you? Have you all gone blind? Of course someone was there. Why do you think I had to go around again, twice at that?" A second officer stepped forward and asked what type of plane he had seen. "It was some bloody madman in a biplane. It cut in before me just as I was touching down." By now the flight commander had made his way through the crowd and explained that there was no one else flying and that there were no biplanes at Montrose that day. Stubbornly, the pilot said, "Sir, I know what I saw. I saw it not once but twice. The damn plane was right in front of me." Finally, the flight commander gestured to the men to return to their quarters, which they did. No one that night apart from the flying sergeant saw anything. At the time, word about the incident went around the airfield, but under the sheer pressure of combat, the report of that night's incident was eventually filed away and labelled as nothing more than an unusual story. It was the 27th of May 1913, little more than a year before the First World War began, and Lieutenant Desmond L. Arthur, an Irishman, was flying over Montrose in a BE-2 biplane. It's said that without warning the plane lost control and plummeted to the ground. Desmond Arthur, who had been a certified pilot since the summer of 1912, died that day. The crash was witnessed by dozens of people. It's reported that when the upper wing snapped at 2,500 feet, the plane then fell into a dive and the pilot was thrown from the cockpit. He was seen falling out of the sky by many bystanders. It's said that almost every bone in his body was broken when he hit the ground. Training accidents were common. One American pilot training at Montrose in the early days once wrote, "There was a crash every day and a funeral every week." But as this was an experienced pilot, and there was no clear explanation to how the wing broke free, the Accidents Investigation Committee of the Royal Aero Club descended on Montrose and came to the conclusion that the wing had broken due to incompetent repair. The mechanic responsible was unknown, but the accident was considered a possible murder when the plane was found to have a broken spar, because the broken area was covered in fabric, concealing it from the pilot. Three years would pass before the death of Desmond Arthur got the attention of the British authorities. By this time war raged on in Europe, and Montrose had a crew of new trainee pilots. The instructors lived in the old building, which was once the home to the No. 2 Squadron, the squadron Desmond Arthur once belonged to. In autumn of 1916, a staff officer by the name of Major Cyril Foggin was returning to the old sleeping quarters. He noticed another pilot there in full flying gear walking in front of him along the path. Foggin did not recognise the pilot, as the evening was dark and shadows filled the yard. He watched as the stranger reached the door, but did not open it. Moments later, Foggin too reached the doors, expecting to see the man still standing there. No one was there, and the doors were closed. Stood in the darkness, confused, Foggin considered the situation. He had seen a man directly in front of him, and he was sure the stranger hadn't taken a sudden left or right turn. Cyril Foggin was a headstrong, pragmatic man, not easily shaken, and after a moment of reflection, he simply put it down to a strange occurrence, one he could not explain, and left it at that. Several days passed during which Foggin had considered the event carefully. He decided it was simply his imagination, as he did not want to believe in the possibility of an apparition lurking in the shadows at Montrose. That was until a few days later when it happened again, almost exactly as it had before. Cyril Foggin did not make an official report or tell anyone else about the incident for some time. He was a respected man, an older man, and he knew that talk of phantoms would probably lead him to being sent for psychological analysis and ultimately losing his post. But while Foggin was keeping his secrets, other pilots were experiencing similar visions. In a few instances there were two pilots who saw the same thing, but even so, like Foggin, they kept their experiences to themselves. None of them wanted to be ridiculed or sent home being labelled a madman. This trend of secrecy, however, was short-lived. One night, a senior officer was awakened with a start. He sat up in his bed and saw a pilot in full flight gear, sat upright in a chair opposite his bed. "Who the bloody hell are you, and what the hell are you doing here?" the senior pilot exclaimed. There was no answer. He moved from his bed to confront the mystery man, but by the time the instructor had wearily risen to his feet, the stranger had vanished. Other pilots were roused from their sleep by the same vision in the dead of night, and as there were often fireplaces and stoves with open grates, there was always a degree of light in the room. During the same year, several men who were on guard duty at night challenged a pilot whom none of them could identify. When approached and questioned about his business there, he did not respond. When the man faded from view before their eyes, the guards ran, abandoning their posts. This was something that usually meant severe punishment, but when the reasons were given for their actions, and because the sightings had now become so infamous, no disciplinary action was taken. The stories by now were so well known in the Royal Flying Corps that they spread throughout the British Isles and beyond. By now several pilots had requested transfers from Montrose, either because of what they'd seen or what they'd heard. Obviously now a concern, senior officers and investigators had no other option than to seriously consider the stories as truth. At this point, no one had actually related a name to the ghostly pilot, but the question was raised and many wanted an answer. Who was the ghost of Montrose, and why is he appearing now? Then someone suggested a name. It was a man by the name of C.G. Gray. He was the editor of the flying magazine The Aeroplane. Back in 1913, the Royal Flying Corps was a much smaller operation before it became the Royal Air Force. The editor claimed to have known most, if not all, of the pilots at Montrose at the time, and suggested that Lieutenant Desmond L. Arthur was the phantom pilot. When he was killed in 1913, he received a funeral with full military honours and was buried at Sleepy Hillock Cemetery in Montrose. But in the summer of 1916, an official investigation concluded that Arthur had in fact died from his own incompetence, rather than mechanical fault caused by a murderous mechanic. This report had now tainted the name of Arthur, a man revered in the Royal Flying Corps. It wasn't until after this report had been made in 1916 that the ghost appeared. People began to suspect that Arthur had returned to somehow defend himself and clear his name. The investigative teams now lashed out at the review board, claiming that they had unfairly dragged the dead man's name through the mud. Whether or not the review board truly realised they were wrong, or had just received too much pressure from the Royal Flying Corps for the investigators to reverse the outcome, a final report was made that stated the wing of the plane was in fact damaged, and Arthur had died through no fault of his own. Some say Arthur's ghost made its last appearance on Christmas Eve 1916, while others say it was the 17th of January 1917. Whatever the date, many believe that this was the last appearance of Arthur's ghost, while others believe he continued to materialise for many years to come. Now let me take you back to the beginning of the video, to the curious incident in 1940, the incident involving the Hurricane pilot searching for the German Heinkel bomber, who was forced to abandon landing his plane twice because a mystery biplane appeared on the runway, a biplane that no one but the Hurricane pilot saw. There was no human apparition, but could this have been a vision of Lieutenant Desmond L. Arthur's plane, echoing almost 30 years into the future? Montrose continued as a training base for many years, and one of the newcomers in 1949 was a man by the name of Eric Simpson. On their arrival, Simpson and the other new recruits were stunned to be presented with a document informing them that the camp was haunted by the ghost of Desmond Arthur. It would seem that by the late 40s the apparition was back. One particular sighting was by a Scottish pilot who was scared to death when during the night he witnessed a pilot leant over a desk, filing through papers. It wasn't so much the appearance of a pilot in full flight gear that scared him, it was the fact that the man stood in front of him was only partially visible. He stated that from the knees down there was nothing, as if the figure was suspended in mid-air. This was the last reported sighting of what was believed to be Lieutenant Arthur's ghost for another 14 years. The day was pleasant and the sun was out when Sir Peter Masefield, one of the best-known pilots in Britain, took to the skies in his personal Chipmunk, a single-engine monoplane. He was flying from Dalcross near Inverness to Shoreham-on-Sea in southeast England. This route brought him close to the now abandoned airfield at Montrose. Masefield was familiar with the old airfield and looked forward to seeing it from the sky on such a clear day. He eased into a gentle turn, flying along the shore, cruising at 2,500 feet. He spotted the old runway ahead as it slowly came into view. As he admired the landscape, another plane came into view. It was at about the same altitude and appeared to be an old biplane, an ancient relic of aviation. It was a BE-2 training plane, which had been part of the Royal Flying Corps during the First World War. As he gained on the plane and the pilot came into view, Masefield saw that he was wearing an old-style flying suit and scarf, which was once popular in the old days of British aviation. He looked on in amazement at what he assumed must have been a renovation project by another enthusiast. If it was the first he had ever seen of its kind. Then, as if in slow motion, the biplane's wing came loose and flapped hopelessly in the wind. The entire upper wing followed, and soon Masefield was watching the plane whirl into a spin and plummet towards the ground. He watched in horror as the aircraft made contact with the earth below, near the old Montrose airfield. Masefield quickly landed his plane at a nearby golf course and called on the assistance of some golfers to help him locate the wreckage. Without much persuasion, they followed Masefield to the field where he had seen the plane go down. There was no wreckage, no remains, no smoke or any sign of a crashed plane. The men looked on, bewildered, at an empty field, not least of all Peter Masefield, who could do nothing to convince the other men that there had in fact been a crash in that precise location. Nothing was ever found, and there has been no explanation given for the events of that day, on the 27th of May 1963. It was 50 years to the day that Lieutenant Desmond L. Arthur's BE-2 biplane had plummeted to the ground at Montrose. Little was known of Arthur aside from his flying career, but when his great-nephew came forward with a locket that had been retrieved from Arthur's breast pocket before burial, a little insight into his private life was given. The locket held the photo of a young woman by the name of Winsome Ropener. She was from West Hartlepool, and she was the woman Arthur intended to marry. According to Miss Ropener's surviving family, although she eventually married a few years after his death, she never did forget the young pilot. On the 27th of May 2013, 100 years since his death, Desmond Arthur was honoured when members of the Montrose Air Station Heritage Centre laid a commemorative wreath on his grave at Sleepy Hillock Cemetery.